All right, as Pastor said, my name is Christopher Nelson. For those of you who don't know me, I'm an attorney here in the county, do mostly estate planning and probate, including a lot of probate litigation, family fights over the inheritance. And as an attorney, I think I can, or a lot of times I feel like I've seen more than my fair share of fighting and conflict. And I've really gotten a distaste for it. I mean, my dream as an attorney would be to get out of the litigation and just do the planning side of things. But God hasn't opened that door yet, so, we live in a conflict-ridden world, so we work through it. As an attorney, a lot of people think attorneys like to fight. Well, that's what you do. You handle lawsuits, you sue people, you fight, don't you? Well, no. Attorneys are first advisors, and then two, dispute resolvers. So if I can resolve your dispute by reaching a settlement with the other side, I'm going to do that. And in the same way, in personal conflicts, if I can help you resolve a dispute, and if we can look at a situation and keep it from falling apart, damage control early, keep a dispute as a dispute, keep it from turning into an argument or a fight, I think that's a wise thing to do. And so a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is addressing it at the early stages here. But first, let's find out, what do we normally do? How do we normally handle things? And you've all seen little kids fight. I'm sure none of you did this when you were children, but, Mama, he hit me. No, I didn't. Yes, he did. No, I didn't. And it's just back and forth. And it doesn't stop until Mom comes in with the power of authority or maybe some other power and puts an end to it. But we don't really grow up. We just get more sophisticated about it. The plaintiff files his lawsuit and says, Your Honor, this person did these wrong things to me because of A, B, C, and D. And then the defendant comes back and says, No, Your Honor, I am not liable to him because of 1, 2, 3, and 4. In the midst of the lawsuit, they're going back and forth and basically saying, You did so, I did not. You did so, I did not. Until you come in and either they get tired, they have litigation burnout, or they have litigation bankruptcy and they settle, or it goes to a case and the judge says you owe so-and-so however much money. But what's going on there? What is going on mentally with the people doing this? And I like to think of it as when the plaintiff files his complaint or the child says, Mama, he hit me, they draw a line in the sand. They say, this is what's right on my side, that's wrong on their side, they need to come over here. And when the other people say, no, I didn't, they draw a line in the sand. And each time you repeat to yourself, I'm right and they're wrong, you draw that line deeper. And soon you go from a line in the sand to a ditch to a full-blown trench. And then as people are sitting there and it's escalating, you're soon looking at Flanders Field of Verdun, trench warfare. People are dug into their positions. They're convinced they're right. All they see is what they're right, and they know you're wrong, while they're lobbing artillery shells across no man's land to the other guy. What's the effect of that? What happened? How many of you are familiar with World War I history and how terrible that was? The amount of loss of life. For what? What's the effect of trench warfare? You have stagnation. The parties are stuck there. They're not moving. And in interpersonal conflicts, we want resolution. We were talking earlier about our relationships need to be more important than our desires of I want the thermostat at a certain degree. We also have hardening of positions. Just like when you get into trench warfare, they start bracing them up and building concrete bunkers and pillboxes, and you're not going to dislodge me. People get hardened in their relationships, and they don't go anywhere. And then last but certainly not least is the colossal consumption of commodities. Or in other words, it's really expensive. Even apart from all the jokes about high lawyer bills and all, it takes an emotional toll on you to keep fighting, to keep focusing on how I'm right and they're wrong. And that emotional energy and that stress on you drains you physically. So it's not only financially, but it's physically and emotionally straining. And to what end? Again, you're just stuck in your trench. in the mud, in the dirt, not going anywhere. That's holding back you, not only in your relationship with the person you're arguing against, but also in your other relationships, because you're so focused on this one fight. I've seen it happen so many times. And let me just give you one example from my experience as an attorney. There was one probate fight I was handling, very, very acrimonious between a couple of siblings. The litigation was intense for 1.5 years. We tried to reach a settlement. We weren't able to. We went to trial. What was the result of that trial? First is attorney's fees on just my side of the case of $120,000. I talk about colossal consumption of commodities. It's expensive. It really is. If you want to fight, there is a cost to it. And so much of it's avoidable. But also, not only that, is the family relationship that was ruined. As these two sisters kept focusing on I'm right and you're wrong, they went further and further and further away, and I would not be surprised. And these are seniors here. My client, in the course of this, she turned 80 years old. So it's not only kids who fight. Like I said, we don't grow up, we just get more sophisticated. I wouldn't be surprised if she hasn't talked to her sister in the 4 years since the trial was over. And I hope that they found some way to reconcile and get back together, but I really don't expect it. And then finally, although I was able to win the case for my client, the judge said she was right, the other side was wrong. When we got to the end, was my client happy? Not really. There was a sense of satisfaction of her position being vindicated, but she made a very telling comment to me. She said, after going through all this, I'm convinced that we have a great legal system. We really do. But we have a very poor justice system. Where's the justice? And if I'm right, why did it cost me so much? Because that's the nature of conflict. That's the nature of fighting. So I want to try to give you some tips here, some things that I've learned from other people, I've implemented in my own life to keep a conflict from turning into a fight, turning into trench warfare here. And so most disputes start with some kind of a discussion. Somebody comes up and confronts someone else. I also want to say, I'm saying this in the context of like friends at church or neighbors, people who know each other. Not so much with complete strangers or the drunk who wrecks you on the in a car accident. But most disputes start with some kind of a discussion. You come up, you confront the other person, they confront you saying, you did these things and that hurt me, that offended me, whatever the complaint they have. And sometimes and in a lot of minor situations, just one conversation, you're done, it resolves it and you go away friends. But there's a lot of times that doesn't happen. A lot of the discussions, because you get into that trench building mentality of drawing lines, you don't get resolution. The dispute grows instead of getting resolved here. So I want to focus again, as I said, on some tips I've learned in that initial discussion phase to keep a discussion from becoming an argument and just devolving into trench warfare. So I've seen that in these discussions we have two main problems with them. Okay? First is that nobody's really listening. Okay, you've all been there, right? You get in a discussion with somebody and it's like, they're not listening to me. So that's one problem. The other problem that I've seen is nobody's really speaking well either. So if we don't have anybody listening, nobody's speaking well, are we surprised that discussions don't degenerate into fights quickly? I mean, isn't that supposed to be the heart and soul of any discussion? Listening and speaking well. So I want to talk about listening well and speaking well. But before we get into that, I want to kind of create an illustration here, a scenario that as we go through these points, I can kind of relate back to that to illustrate these various tips I'll be giving you. So assume here for the moment that you just bought a house, you moved into a new neighborhood, you're finally getting settled in, you've been there about a month or so, and then you hear a pound on the door, boom, boom, boom. And you open the door and it's like, there's a guy you've seen, you recognize he's the next door neighbor. He comes up to you and say, "Why are you letting your dog dig in my flower beds? Don't you know I spend a lot of time on those and you're letting your dog out and he's coming and he's ruining all my flower beds?" What's our natural response to do that? Now let's assume in this situation that you've got two rather large dogs, 150-pound bull mastiff and a 100-pound German shepherd, both brown. And let's say you are very conscientious at keeping your dogs. They're either in the house or in the backyard, and they have never escaped as long as you've owned them. And now also assume that your dogs don't even dig in their own backyard. Your dogs just don't do that. Now, with that knowledge, and your neighbor comes in accusing you of letting your dogs dig up his flower beds, what's the natural response to do? He comes up in an angry tone of voice. You want to say, wait a minute, stop. Hey, you don't know what you're talking about here. My dogs never get out. And besides, if my dogs dug up your flower beds wouldn't even be in existence anymore because my dogs are so big. Believe me, I have a 90-pound dog. But that doesn't go anywhere. That's just more line drawing. That's digging in. That's the start of trench warfare. So the most important, I think, the most helpful way of avoiding that is to listen well. And by that, I mean listening humbly. Okay? Why do we need humility? Well, I think we all admit that none of us are perfect, right? Has anybody here never made a mistake? Anybody here never offended or hurt somebody, even accidentally? We all realize that we have. So that's the first reason that we need to listen humbly. But then another reason that we need to is we don't know everything. We don't act perfectly, and we don't know everything. I've been in lots of situations. Somebody comes in to my office, I'm talking with them, and they say, this person did thus and such and did these various things that hurt me and cost me money. And I ask them, how do you know it? Well, they'll cite me one event, and they say, I just know it. And it's obvious. It's obvious as the nose on your face. You ever been in a situation where somebody comes to you and say, you've wronged me, and it's obvious and the whole world can see it? Or somebody's wronged you and you think, hey, that's as obvious as the nose on their face. Everybody can see it. Well, that's part of the problem. How many of you, since you've come into this building, have looked at your own nose? Anybody? I don't see any hands. But look, I can see all your noses. Your noses are completely obvious here. So it's clear. So you see, that's the problem, but it's also a hint of the solution and why we need to listen humbly, because we have blind spots. We can't see our noses unless we intentionally look at it, and then we can't even see it that well. So a lot of, this gets into the practical tips of communication and listening. We've got things that we may have done and not realize what the effects are, or we may have done something we didn't even realize it. We need to be willing to listen humbly and allow these other people or God through them to point out our blind spots. The third reason why we need to listen humbly is that your intuition is not infallible. And this is like, I know that this person did me wrong. Well, how do you know it? I just know it. As a lawyer, I have to say, I'm sorry, but I can't take that to the judge. What's the evidence? And in the same way, in our personal lives, we will see one or two bits of evidence, and then we draw a deduction from that. Now, sometimes our sense of I just know it is sometimes right. Our brains are very good at taking pieces of evidence and putting them together to tell a story and to reach a conclusion. But we're not always right. Why? Because we've got blind spots. Because we don't know everything. So we need to listen carefully. We need to listen humbly, be willing to accept their perspective and even accept correction and need when that's necessary. So we've talked about why we need to listen humbly. Why does it work in conflict resolution? Why does listening humbly work? It's my experience that when we get into a conflict, and I see this with my clients all the time, almost every single case, their biggest desire when they come to see me is to be heard and understood. I'm sure can you all identify with that? You're in a dispute with somebody, and one of the biggest complaints is they're not listening to me. So if we can learn to listen to other people and to hear them, that does a couple things. One, using our trench warfare analogy, we're not lobbing artillery shells over at them. We're coming up out of the trench and saying, tell me what's going on. Help me have the perspective here. And that's going, when they see they're not being shot at, they're willing to come out of the trench and talk with you some. It de-escalates. So, and also it's not combative. And it throws people off balance. It really does. Because I've had a situation at a job that I worked at, and it was very difficult many years ago now, thankfully. And the boss came in, it's like, you've got this problem, you know, you're not doing this right. And I just sat there and said, yeah, I see it. The boss was thrown for a loop. It's like, wait a minute, I don't know how to handle this. I was expecting some kickback. But when you don't respond in an antagonistic, in a combative way, it helps the other person to settle down and not respond to you in a further combative way. It just defuses things. So, going back to our neighbor example with the dog digging in there, if you come and say, you know, you ask him, it's like, oh, so the dog's, so you think my dog's doing, you know, digging in your yard? Well, one, I'm sorry to hear that your flowers are being dug up. And you come with this calm, this humble attitude. It's like, well, tell me about it. You know, ask them questions. And that goes a long way to diffuse things. Now, how do we do it? How do we listen humbly? I'm a nuts and bolts guy. I'm a follow the directions guy. I like the point by point, step by step type thing. So I want to do a little bit of that for you today. So first, on how to listen humbly. One, you have to have the right attitude. Humility. So we've talked about that. We've got to be willing to take correction. We've got to be willing for them to say, hey, look, you've got a blind spot on your nose, and your nose has a big red zit on there that you didn't see. Not exactly what we want to hear, but if it's the truth, we need to hear it. And obviously, if there is something that you did wrong, own up to it. They know if you're trying to hide it, if you're trying to be evasive, they're going to see that as you digging your trench deeper, and they're just going to start lobbing even more artillery shells at you. It's not going to help diffuse the thing. And again, in my experience, I've seen it in my personal life and in my work, that an honest apology, and we'll get to that later on this afternoon, Pastor will, does wonders to diffuse a situation, acknowledging when you're wrong. So first we have attitude, then second we have to have the right approach. What is that approach? A lot of people say, okay, I'll sit there and listen, and the whole time they're listening, they're planning. They're analyzing what you're saying, and they're trying to figure out how they're going to rebut every single word you've said. That is not the type of listening I'm talking about. Again, what is their main concern? They want to be heard. They want to be understood. They want their positions validated as much as you want yours validated. So when you listen, you're listening to them in humility to learn what they're thinking, what they're feeling, what's motivating them. Now you have to remember, most of the people we deal with in life try to act logically. They try to be reasonable. And so they don't normally just get into a position and adopt a belief just on a whim or because. They have things that led them to that conclusion. They'll really, you win big points in listening and trying to find out how they came to their conclusion, how they came to that position. And you know what? They may have some things that you didn't know about, and when you hear their story, that makes a lot of sense. Maybe I need to back down a bit. So we have the right attitude, we have the right approach. Next, we have to have full attention. Heard it say active listening. Has anybody heard that term before? Okay, let me give you the opposite. Think of the sulky teenager who's just been called on the carpet by his dad, and it's like, okay, Dad, I'm listening. Let's get this over with. Is that kid listening? No. I think we've all heard as kids, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth. Listen twice as much as you speak. I think in this context, it actually goes beyond that. God gave you 2 eyes, 2 ears, 1 brain, and 1 mouth. You should be listening and watching 4 times as much as you talk. So when you're listening, you're giving them eye contact. You're paying attention to what they're doing. You're not plotting your response to them. So you've got to give them full attention. Don't let your mind be distracted and it's like, okay, you're listening to them and you wander off. It's like, tomorrow's church and we've got this to do and that to do. They pick that up. If somebody's doing that to you, you pick it up. So you got to listen with full attention, active listening. It takes work. And I can tell you that's something that I've had to, it's taken me a long time to learn. I'm not there all the way. I can say by the grace of God I'm better than I was in dealing with my clients. And I can definitely see my client relationships have gotten better the better I've been able to listen to them actively and attentively. So we have the right attitude, we have the right approach, we give full attention. Next one is answering. Don't answer too early. Hear them out. Let them finish. Our default is as soon as you hear they say something that you know is wrong and you can easily disprove, you want to jump in there and say, wait a minute, stop, that point's not wrong, and here's the 5 reasons why. That's not listening humbly, that's listening to build your attack. Don't do that. Don't answer too early. Don't even answer to yourself. Let them finish. Active listening, paying close attention until they're done. And then finally, under listening is acknowledging their points. Like I said, everybody wants to be heard. They want to be understood. And one of the biggest ways you can do that is acknowledging what they've said. It's also called reflecting. So like in our dog example, you come, the neighbor comes over, you say, I'm sorry to hear that. Can you tell me, when's this been happening? He says, well, 1:30 every day. Okay, and what, can you describe the dog that's doing this? He says, a little white dog, and he's about how big? About, maybe knee high. Okay, his head's about knee high? Yeah. Okay, and, what happens in that situation? So, well, I go and I run him off, and he goes and hides behind the bushes on your front porch. I'm like, okay, so okay, I see that, and I can see, I see your flowers as I'm coming and going, and I see that your flowers are really look nice. I can see you put a lot of effort into that. And so I can understand why you're upset when a dog comes in and starts digging them up, because they're undoing all this hard work you've put into it. And so I hear that you're saying that it's a dog about knee high and it's white and comes around about 1:30. So, okay, yeah, I'm at work at 1:30 in the afternoon, so I'm not there to see that. I acknowledge that. And so what's going on in that whole situation? You're hearing them out. You're validating that he has a legitimate concern about his flowers, that he's got a lot of work in there, and he doesn't want it to be wasted. He takes pride in that. And so there's nothing wrong with that. You validate that. You acknowledge what they're saying. And that's really going to diffuse it, because now when they felt heard, they're more willing to listen to you. So then that brings us to part 2. We want to learn to listen well, and we want to learn to speak well. And by speaking well, that's speaking gently. Our natural response in a conflict is to just, unload on them, give them the full 9 yards. And a lot of times our words that we use are like artillery shells. It's not just the word. These words contain a lot of meaning, and often it's explosive meaning. And a lot of times we don't even realize it. So we want to learn to speak well and speak gently. So why does it work? If somebody feels attacked, if you feel attacked, what are you going to do? You're going to hole up. You're going to withdraw into your trench. You may start lobbing your own artillery shells back and forth. I'm sure you've all seen that happen. People start disputing, and then they start yelling, and they're shouting on top of each other. That doesn't produce anything good. But if you're speaking gently to them, if they're not feeling attacked, they're more willing to come out of the trench and listen to what you have to say. And then also, when they're out of the trench and you're out of the trench, you can move around, you can negotiate, you can get the perspective and see what's going on here. Whereas if you're just stuck in your trench, all you see is the inside of your trench and a little bit over the top. You don't know what's going on, really. Not really. So speaking gently, speaking well is very important. So how do we do that? Like with listening well, it starts in the same place, with the right attitude. And one, you're not going to have an offensive and attack attitude. We're not looking to win at all costs. We're looking to resolve the situation, hopefully peaceably, and to maintain and restore the relationship. You like to see this come through where your relationship's better than it was then when this difficulty came up. So you don't have an attack attitude. Also, you don't have a defensive attitude. Okay, so what are you saying? I'm saying you can defend yourself, but don't be defensive. What does that mean? Defend, but not defensively. Well, you need to be able to state your case calmly and very dispassionately. Don't think of, just the facts, ma'am. But how do you know when you're being defensive? One is, a lot of times, and especially with kids, but I've seen it with adults, they get this whiny voice and they paint themselves as a martyr. And you did this to me, but I did this right, and I did this, and I didn't do that. And does that really help resolve conflicts? No, we grow up, but we get older, but we don't really grow up. We just get more sophisticated. So we don't want to have that kind of an attitude of the whining or the complaining. Or sometimes you're defensive because we all instinctively know that the best defense is a good offense. And sometimes if you're feeling defensive, you just fire right back at them, and it turns into just a hailstorm of artillery. So there's an art to this, and it takes doing, and it takes intent and forethought to be able to defend but not be defensive about it. So in the same way, with this example of the neighbor and the dog digging, you can come out and say, well, okay, sir, after you've listened to him, and he knows that you've listened to him, you can ask him, have you seen my dogs? Have you had a chance to meet my dogs yet? And you're not even assertively saying, it's like, dude, you got the wrong dogs. There's no way that could be my dog. But you're opening the door and inviting him in. You're saying it, but you're not being defensive about it. Number 2, after a correct attitude of non-defensive, you want to, and this all grows out of that, is you want to avoid antagonistic assumptions. For like in this neighbor's example, he says, I know this is your dog because when I run him out, he goes and hides behind the potted plants on your front porch. So he's got to be your dog. If he wasn't your dog, you wouldn't hide on your front porch. Well, that neighbor's making an assumption there. What if those potted plants are the nearest hiding place? And the dog is running there because that's the first, and when he goes there, he knows that this irate neighbor leaves him alone, so he just holds up there for a while. You don't know. See, he's seeing one little bit of evidence, the dog runs there, and then he's making an assumption based on that. An assumption in this situation that's not necessarily true. Like we say in court a lot of times, people have assumptions all the time, and assumptions are not evidence. We want to make our decisions, reach our conclusions based on evidence and not on assumptions, not on gut feelings if the evidence says otherwise. And making these kind of assumptions don't work because, one, they're antagonistic. It's going on the attack. The other person's going to withdraw back into their trench and start lobbing their own artillery shells back at you. And they also know, they can see when you're making an assumption about them and they know it's not true. And that's communicating to them, you're not listening. You don't care enough to hear them out and really try to understand the situation. You're only wanting to push them and cow them, bring them under your thumb, under your domination, under your control. So it doesn't work. So that's why again, getting back to the point of listening humbly. When you listen humbly, you hear what's going on, and then you don't have to make assumptions, or you don't have to make as many assumptions. And when you learn to see those assumptions, you can realize and back off from it. The next one here we have is you want to avoid overstatements. And these are normally pretty easy to spot. The universal statements. You always do this, or you never do that, or it's obvious that this happens. Do those fix? Those don't help anything because, one, they're rarely ever true. You notice even here I never said never. Because these universal statements, these overstatements are rarely true, and the person you're accusing knows that, and again, that's telling them you're not listening, you don't care about them, all you care about is winning the fight. So then they're going to stop listening, it shuts them down. So we need to avoid those kinds of overstatements. Next, we need to keep your perspective in perspective. And these all tie in, okay? Because a lot of the assumptions we make are based on the perspective we have. And sometimes you don't realize it until you stop and think about it because you're in the heat of the moment, in the heat of battle. But you stop and realize that, the conclusions you reach are a matter of the perspective and the view from which you're seeing things. So I found some ways, a couple of kind of catchphrases, magic words, if you will, that really seem to work well when you're communicating with somebody else that, hey, I realize this is my perspective. So a lot of times somebody comes up and I'll say, you know, from where I stand, standing here, it appears that this and such and these things happened. But I realize I'm only seeing it from my side. Could you tell me what your perspective is? I want to hear your side of the story. So there we have speaking gently and listening humbly linked together. And that one really helps because it's inviting them to explain. It's showing them, hey, I'm caring enough about you, what you think, to go ask the question, say what I think, but then ask the question and let you respond. So that works really well. Another phrase a sentence I use here that works well is a lot of times when somebody says something, and you know, it's something that was hurtful to me. And you come out, especially when this is among people who are friends or people you know well, it's like, you know, do you realize, you know, remember this comment you made the other day? Yeah, I remember it. Well, I don't know if you realize this, and I don't really think you intended it to be this way, but when I heard those words, they landed on my ears and then explained how that hit you, how that hurt you, in very gentle, non-confrontational terms. Why do these work? Because one, it acknowledges we have limited perspective, we have our blind spots, and they realize that we're willing to listen and really get to the bottom of this and hear what they say. And so I've found those to be two things that really work well, saying, you know, from my perspective, it looks like this. Or, you know, your words landed on my ears this way. And one of the wonderful things about that is you're not blaming them for trying to attack you, so they're not feeling attacked. And at the same way, you're not necessarily admitting that you heard wrong. Maybe you did. You're leaving the option open. And you're not, in that statement also doesn't assume evil motives on their part. You're assuming that maybe they said something completely innocent. Maybe they intended to compliment you, and it just came out wrong, or you were having a bad day and so you heard it wrong. So it allows them to clear the air. You get up above, out of the trenches, see the lay of the land, and say, oh, this is what you meant? Oh, you were trying to compliment me. Well, you know, I'm sorry for mishearing it, and you can patch things up. It just works well. And because it's not confrontational, it's not blaming, it diffuses. It brings people down off their high horse, if you will. It takes the trigger finger off the trigger of the artillery guns. Next, number 5 is we need to gently educate people. It's like, okay, this is the part. Now I can finally tell them my story. But we've got to do this gently, again with the right attitude. And also, some tips on this is, one, keep your comments short. Don't unload the whole 15-minute saga on them. You're going to lose them. Nobody's really got attention span that long, and especially when they're in a tense conversation that's about to turn to an argument. Make a few statements, pause, give them a chance to respond. This is showing them value. This is showing that you care about what they say and that you're not out just to win. You're out to find what the truth is and how to resolve the problem. Another good, helpful tip is show, don't tell. An excellent example of this in the Bible is when the prophet Nathan confronted King David after his sin with Bathsheba. He didn't come up and said, and he could have, he was God's prophet, he was God's official spokesman, he could say, David, you did this and you did that and you did that and you're guilty. And it would have been accurate. But what would have happened with David? What happens with you when somebody comes pointing the finger at that? You start digging the trench. Duck out, you don't want to get hit by the artillery, you're going to duck. But what did Nathan do? He told David a story. He said, look, here's a situation. This man had this one little pet lamb, and this rich guy went and he took it for himself. David got mad, and Nathan said, you're the man. And David's like, you're right. I confess before God. So if you can show people, use word pictures, use stories, analogies, and that way you can make somebody else be the bad guy and then kind of point them and say, what this situation was is kind of like that. Another big point is do not lecture or patronize. You're dealing with adults, not with 3-year-olds. Treat them like rational, intelligent adults. And I've seen it a lot of times in one situation with a family we were in at a church we were in several years ago. And I just saw they had a son who's 15, 16 years old, and his mom and his older sisters kept like, he just kept talking down at him. And I'm thinking, are you really helping him to grow up and be mature with that kind of an attitude and talking down like he's his 4-year-old little brother? And in the same way, when we're in conflict with people, we're talking down to them, that's taking a very prideful attitude of ourselves, diminishing them. It's just a subtle way of, it's not an evasion, on that slippery slope diagram. It's a very subtle assault on them. And by just in our attitude, our tone of voice, talking down to them. So avoid that. These are adults, they'll know, they can tell when you're talking down to them, they can tell when you're trying to listen honestly and lay it out clearly. So as we're gently educating, keep your comments short, give them a chance to listen, give them a chance to talk and you listen. Show, don't tell, don't lecture, patronize them. And then another one, and this has been a theme of, since I've learned this one has been a theme of the way I deal with people. Most people say, when you want to talk, how do you communicate? Well, you want to communicate so you can be understood. No, that's not good enough, especially when you're in a very tense situation and in conflict and emotions are flaring and people aren't thinking as rationally as they normally would. Don't communicate so that you can be understood. Communicate in such a way that you cannot be misunderstood. Remove any margin of error that you can. And maybe that's a big deal for me in law, and I'm drafting papers to the court, and the other attorney's going to scrutinize them and try to rip them apart. I got to lay things out clearly. And in the same way, we have to do that in our personal relationships. We've got to communicate in such a way that we cannot be misunderstood. And we got to remember, if we say, well, this thing's clear, and you're making these assumptions based on what you know and what you've seen about when you're explaining the situation, they may not have seen that. They may not know those facts. Like one time there's some kids that we knew, and they had gone to this event, and they really enjoyed it, and they just jumped into the middle of the event and telling this one scene that happened. It's like, and they're this and this and this, and I'm like, huh? What are you talking about? I have no context here. And that's, again, showing, and these are, younger kids. You don't expect too much, and this wasn't anything important. So you stop and you ask them, okay, what was going on here? What was the story? Oh, okay, now I see why you enjoyed that so much. But in terms of conflict, we can make assumptions that they know what we did at the time, and that's often not the case. So when you're communicating, that's when you get back to the recognizing perspective. From my perspective, I saw this, that, and the other. What's yours? So when we get into this, back to our example of the angry neighbor here, how much different would it be instead of you firing back at him? You say, okay, yeah, I see, how your flowers mean a lot to you. They'd mean a lot to me if I put that much work in them and had them looking that beautiful. But would you like to come meet my dogs? Would you like to come and point out and show me which of these dogs was doing that? And then maybe we can talk about a way that, I'm willing to hear your suggestions about how to secure them or something like that. And what happens next? Ball's in his court. We don't know. We're to live at peace as much as is possible with us. So, when we're finding ourselves in difficult situations, stop and think of the cost of trench warfare. It's no fun. but when you get in it, it's hard to get out. So just remember to listen well by listening humbly, to speak well by speaking gently, and just give it a try and see if it won't reduce the trench warfare in your life. Thanks.